Oh, now it's being.
Welcome to the webinar, The Implementation of Harm Reduction and Life Skills Education for Housed Individuals. The webinar is now being recorded. Over to you, Matt and James.
Thank you very much, Edith. This is James. As Mariana said, I'm a case manager with McGinnis Health Group, and I'm joined here today by my colleague Matt Mitchell. And I'm very grateful to everyone who's joining us on our new Friday time slot. As the title states, we will be talking about harm reduction and life skills for newly housed individuals. This is a topic that was suggested by one of the sites, I believe it was Family Health Centers. When Matt and I were talking about how to sort of slice up this presentation, thought it'd be good to have him talk a little bit about harm reduction. I'll talk a little bit about life skills, and then we'll team up to present a couple of common scenarios. The important part here is that we also want to hear from you because there's a lot of expertise in the room, so to speak. And we actually have these slides projected, so if you have a question or a comment, please feel free to type something in and we will do our best to address it. These scenarios and this information we're going to present is certainly not the final chapter, and we may end up running a little bit over or we may finish early. We're going to play it by ear, but that's the thing that makes these types of live presentations kind of exciting. So I'll hand it over to Matt Mitchell, who is a case manager with McGinnis Health Group, to talk about harm reduction.
All right, this is Matt. I guess I'm just going to go ahead and start from the top. What is harm reduction? So in general, I guess for those of you who may not be familiar or need a little brushing up, it's essentially an approach with the goal of reducing harmful consequences of human behavior. You're probably familiar with harm reduction in some of its more, what are often considered controversial forms, things like needle exchanges or using opioid replacement therapy, things like methadone or Suboxone. But you're also probably familiar with harm reduction in ways that are maybe more applicable to your regular life, like on New Year's Eve, when a lot of cities will implement free taxis or free public transportation to try to reduce the amount of drunk driving that happens, or even things like safe sex education. These are all sort of implementations of harm reduction. I guess in some ways you can think of harm reduction as the opposite of zero tolerance, not in that everything is tolerated, but rather that maybe everything is on the table for negotiation. Rather than being sort of an all or nothing approach, it's sort of the idea that small change is better than no change at all. Harm reduction sort of requires a bit of a frame shift. It's not really about controlling other people's behaviors, but focused on improving outcomes with sort of a focus on incremental change. The example here, cutting down from 10 cigarettes a day to 8 cigarettes per day, doesn't probably seem like very much, but the important thing here is that that's an example of change, and that's something to be celebrated. So why is harm reduction important? I guess for me, it kind of comes down to the idea that change can be really overwhelming, especially if you're presented with sort of an all or nothing option. It's really easy to choose nothing, because if you can't make all of the changes, well, then you're left with nothing. And I have to say that I'm sort of a personal believer in something that I like to think of as behavioral inertia. I don't know whether this is evidence-based, but the idea is that a person at rest tends to stay at rest. But if you can help someone make a small change, all of a sudden other possibilities for change open up. And I think that's particularly applicable if you're working with vulnerable populations, people who have a vast array of behavioral and medical issues, that just changing anything may seem overwhelming, but if you can help someone begin by making small changes, all of a sudden it seems more possible to change other things as well. I think it's also worth noting that harm reduction can be implemented in a way that helps reduce stigma. And it sort of comes back to my contrast with harm reduction versus an all or nothing approach. When someone is faced with all or nothing, if they can't make all of the changes, there's something maybe shameful feeling about that. And that can help reinforce a sense of stigma around what they're facing. I think it's maybe part of this idea is that with harm reduction, rather than imposing external constraints, a big part of it is the idea of coming alongside the client that you're working with, trying to promote small, tangible, and achievable changes in ways that helps promote healing for the client themselves and in a way that kind of comes from within them and is not something that we're imposing from the outside. And equally important is, I think harm reduction can help us as service providers remember that our clients have autonomy. They have the right to make decisions in their own lives. And by sort of shifting our focus away from saying they need to do this one thing, but rather letting them sort of guide the process about what changes they feel like they can make, that it helps us remember that our clients get to make decisions about how they want to live, and we're here to help them through that process.
Hey, it's me. So I'll talk a little bit about life skills. Thank you very much, Matt. I appreciate that. So there's a picture of this life skills wheel here, and it's kind of complex, but serves to sort of underscore that everything is kind of connected. Life skills are the basic tools that we use to navigate the world around us. So these are skills that help people stay housed, retain employment, and just cope with life in general. So some examples of life skills would be managing a monthly budget, communicating with landlords and neighbors, understanding the terms of a lease or tenancy agreement, stress reduction, making and keeping appointments, developing and maintaining social networks. These are some examples, but the life skills that we use are going to, the life skills that we are going to employ are going to be different for each person. So a lot of implementing these life skills are identifying life skills. So that's something that you would work with the patient on doing. We as individuals learn life skills over a period of time, and we fine-tune them through trial and error. Right. Thank you. And for us as individuals, we have mentors or other people in our lives who help teach us these life skills. And support systems can vary from person to person. I found that with the patients that I serve, discussing support systems can be very therapeutic. And the secondary gain of this can be that people come to realize they have a much larger support system than they realize. And it also helps remind the client who to ask for support when in crisis. So it's also important to recognize that some of the clients that you work with may be visual learners. So if you need to sort of make a visual chart as opposed to discussing it and making a list, you can sort of reconfigure it a number of different ways so that it's effective for the patient. Just be sure to ask them what their preference is, because people do learn in many, many different ways. So some of the life skills that we learn are very, very basic things, such as changing a light bulb or checking the mail, checking bills on a regular basis. And some of them are more complex, such as negotiating with a landlord or property manager, addressing rental arrearages, or setting goals. it's very uncommon that someone would develop life skills evenly across the board, across all spheres of our lives. It's important that the clients we serve understand that some of their struggles are struggles that everyone encounters. So paying bills on time is something that I personally have struggled with. It's something that everyone will struggle with at a certain point in their lives. Paying bills in a timely fashion can be very, very confusing. Normalizing these situations and sharing struggles from our own lives can help reduce stigma. An example would be this morning I met with a patient who was very upset with himself for missing an appointment with a medical provider. I thought in the moment that it was very appropriate to disclose that in the past I have missed appointments with medical providers, either because I was nervous or scared or because I forgot about the appointment. Like, this stuff happens to everyone. It's normal stuff. So it's really important for patients to understand that life is a series of ups and downs. The number one rule being that in order to stay housed, you have to pay your rent and maintain a peaceful environment in housing. Most of the other components and most of the other life skills you develop can be done to suit your style and at your own pace. But really, the message is for the individual to pay your rent. And you should let them know that really, in terms of like landlords, this is what your landlord is expecting. As long as that's taken care of, everything is fine. With a lot of our patients that we work with, they may have limited or no housing history whatsoever. And as a result, when they're housed, they're ill-equipped to cope with day-to-day life because they have underdeveloped life skills. And as Matt said, this can be damaging to their self-esteem. A patient may be thinking, what's wrong with me? Everyone knows how to do this. Why don't I know how to do this? It's important to stress that learning is a process and that everyone learns differently and at their own pace, and that's fine. The reason that people may not know how to do something is because they have no experience doing it. It's fine. So helping someone develop effective life skills can reduce stress and strain in all areas of their life. And it can also help them assimilate into the world around them. And assimilation is a process, and it happens by degree. I think there are plenty of people that work at health centers or are case managers who sometimes feel a little unassimilated. Life can do that to you. However, a lot of the day-to-day tasks that an individual may be called to perform, they're seemingly mundane. I mean, on the surface, opening a bill and reviewing it, getting a money order, putting it into an envelope, getting a stamp, and sending it off to whoever the bill is owed to, it's very ordinary. But it keeps you housed. So these are the things that it's the fuel that sort of helps keep you moving forward. So I think a lot of what we're doing is we're teaching people these very sort of mundane skills, but we're also stressing why it's important to develop consistency with these skills. And also it's our job to, in helping people assimilate into the world around them, it's our job to promote self-sufficiency and when needed provide guidance. It is a delicate balance, and building trust with your client will help you know when to step in. If someone has a bill that they have to pay every month, I mean, you can be sure that it will get paid if you say, well, bring it to me and I'll do it. But that's not what we're shooting for here. We want people to develop those skills, and we want to provide the appropriate amount of assistance. Matt reminded me of the importance of shared goal setting. During times of stress, it can be really useful to remind the client that they have an entire team of folks, sometimes from all areas of their lives, that can support them and who are working with them to accomplish the goals that they set forth. But in some cases, there's an unspoken power differential or power dynamic that needs to be addressed and broken down. So I think it's hard sometimes for patients to come to us and sort of, they might feel like a failure because they need your assistance, but that's definitely not the dynamic you want to set up. You want to set it up so that people feel comfortable coming to you and saying, I don't know how to get a money order. I've never had to do that before. Or I don't understand what this bill is or what its importance is. The stress is on teamwork, not on sort of who does what. So when people come to you and you work with them and they accomplish a goal, it's great to be able to point out that you accomplished a goal together and that it was teamwork, and that eventually, someone will get to a point where they may not need your assistance, but that you're available as long as they do need it, regardless of what the nature of that assistance may be. I say to our patients all the time, I work for you, so use me as a resource. And it's good for them to know that we are working for their overall health and well-being, and to make sure that, that we can contribute in small ways to the overall improvement of their quality of life. We help people with the things that they need help with, but when the goal is accomplished, the success is totally theirs. And we take a fleck of the credit, but they did the hard work by coming to you and by requesting assistance and by working with you to achieve that goal that you set. They do the heavy lifting. So we'll move on to a few sort of common scenarios.
Real quick, I wanted to jump in before sort of a brief intro to some of these case studies. As I was reflecting on some of this, preparing for the webinar, I sort of realized that sort of at the heart of the tension here that I think we should just name is that implementing harm reduction with life skills is challenging because there's so many scenarios we face, especially when we're talking about helping people stay in housing, that really sort of are, in reality, all or nothing propositions. Either your rent is paid or it's not. Paying 75% of your rent just doesn't cut it. Paying bills consistently late doesn't cut it. But harm reduction, so much of harm reduction feels like it's about process and accepting small changes as victories. And there is some real tension, and it makes navigating that sort of complicated. So I think it's worth talking about. So anyway, don't mean to interrupt.
No, I agree. And you're right about the paying the rent. It's like the one thing that you have to do if you're housed. Although I have had patients who were housed, and the reason they lost their housing, was more behavioral issues or stuff outside of paying the rent. But paying rent to a landlord in a timely fashion is a great form of trust building with the landlord. It proves intent. It shows that you're serious about wanting to stay in the place where you're housed. And so these case studies, we have two separate ones. We could have actually come up with about 50 or 70 different ones, but we sort of tried to come up with two that would be most common, things that everyone here would be familiar with if they're working with people that have been housed. So pretty simple here. Case study number one, the client is having difficulty paying the rent in a timely fashion. Lately he or she is about 1 week late in paying the rent. How would you approach this? So we'll step back to before the person is housed. It's always important that when you're talking about housing with a client, that they understand what the rental agreement is before they ever move in. You don't want any sort of surprises. Leases or rental agreements tend to be very lengthy documents that can sometimes hide surprises. If a patient knows what they're getting into, then they know what they're agreeing to. They know what their end of the bargain is. Making sure that both you and the client have a copy of the rental agreement on hand to always refer to is a good idea. And sometimes rental agreements can be very simple 1 or 2 page documents. But usually they have something in there about, how often a person can have visitors and, sort of what, there's stuff that they definitely want to know about, who's responsible for heat and hot water and those things. But there's other stuff that pertains to like sort of behavioral stuff about on premises, or about whether someone can have a pet or not, or about whether someone can make alterations or not to the premises. These are good things to understand ahead of time. And going over the lease together, or at least the important portions, and just sort of having a discussion with it can really help clarify things. I always say to people before they have the final lease signing, so you're ready for this, you want to do this, you agree to this, it's cool. And if they say yes, then you sign the lease. But in terms of in terms of living in housing and working with a landlord and living in a building with neighbors, it's important to make lists. For any sort of goal that people want to accomplish, make a list that includes the steps needed to accomplish the goal. Again, this involves a lot of discussion, but the secondary gain in that is that the patient or client gets to know you, you get to know them, and hopefully there's a lot of trust building there, so that if there's an issue, they'll be more willing to sort of take your word or advice. And they'll also have a feel for who you are as an individual, so they'll get to know your style. I also think that before the person is housed, you want them thinking about sort of what a typical day looks like once they're housed. I think people sort of have this sort of Disney type approach where they wake up and there's bluebirds singing, but people are housed and they're still going to have to do a lot of the day-to-day stuff they would do even if they weren't housed. But they might feel a little more isolated because instead of being in a shelter where they have constant contact with other people, and maybe case managers, they're in their housing, and they might feel a little isolated. So get people thinking about, okay, you wake up, what time do you wake up? You wake up at 9, okay, what's the first thing you do? And what's the second thing and the third thing? And you do this throughout the week so that people have an idea of what their schedule is going to be. And that way you can help identify, the busy times of the month, sort of times when the person may have a little bit more free time, and more specifically, how that downtime can be filled more constructively, and what patterns there are in their schedule. Because I think patterns determine a lot. At the beginning of the month when people get their checks, they have a lot more freedom to do things. Toward the end of the month, if the money runs out, it may feel as though they have a lot less freedom. So our job as case managers is to step in and help them recognize that they have more freedom even if they don't have as much money. And I think the one thing we don't want is for people to sort of be in their apartments alone, feeling as though they don't have any choices, because I think that can sometimes lead to destructive behaviors. I mean, I think it sounds like a weird thing to say, but I think in some cases being housed can trigger relapse, especially if people are feeling lonely, maybe inviting people in, or not knowing what to do with themselves or feeling frustrated. So I think when someone's housed, the case manager wants to have as much contact as they did when the person was in the shelter, maybe even more, to help sort of walk the person through their day-to-day lives and offer structure and, really offer some of those life skills that we're talking about.
One thing that I think is important to me and something I think about when my clients are first housed is the importance of stepping back and recognizing just how much change is going on. Even if many of the clients' behaviors still look the same as when they were in shelter or wherever they were before housing, simply having a routine completely upended and having to create a whole new life for themselves in a new location, trying to figure out, where do I do laundry? How do I get food? Especially if someone's been in a shelter setting where so much of their lives have been dictated by the schedule of shelter staff, and it's time to get up now, you eat here, you can't shower until this time. All of a sudden, having to be self-directed in those things that's a whole lot of change. And so even if a client is struggling with some of those things or things that feel really basic, like not quite understanding how to pay rent on time, recognizing all of the other positive changes that they're making, I think is an important part of the process, and being able to celebrate those changes no matter how small they may seem.
I agree. And I think and the reason that we're sort of stressing, really working with the patient and talking a lot before they're housed, and building those relationships is that a client may not always feel comfortable telling you something. And they may have the mistaken impression that you're judging them, or that, they're going to tell you something that might be perceived as bad news, or that it might cause, you might feel disappointed in them. But with Matt, like what he's saying about celebrating every small success and every small change, hopefully over time patients will come to understand that that's sort of, that we accept them exactly as they are, and that their choices are theirs to make, as Matt said. I think it's important to just really ask questions about how the housing is going in a really non-judgmental way. How's the housing going? What do you like about it? What's tough for you? What do you hate? Don't encourage that. Create a space for the client so that they can be completely honest with you, and just say I hate having to be responsible for a utility bill every month. And that way you know where you can step in and sort of offer assistance, or sort of talk about what it is that they hate about it, and see whether there isn't some sort of common solution to addressing that. If a patient doesn't tell you something, maybe it's because they don't want you to know. Period. And that's okay. Maybe in time they will feel comfortable telling you. Sometimes you may hear things, sometimes you may get a feeling or an intuition, or you may hear something as a landlord. You might, you could ask the patient about it point blank. They might not want to tell you. It's fine. I don't think you want to get into a dynamic where you're demanding information that the client is not ready to disclose to you. And I think it's important that we always use a strengths-based perspective. We want to. So say that you hear from a landlord that someone is a little bit late in paying rent. It's fine to say to a client, you've done a great job of staying housed. I want to make sure that you stay housed. How can we work together as a team to make sure that doesn't happen? And sort of let them talk to you about their feelings on the topic. I think when you're talking to a client, it's very important to really just be receptive. Your body language is very important. I think it's important to nod, make eye contact. Bad habit that I've gotten into is I say right on a lot. Someone's talking right on, because I'm agreeing with them and I'm saying it as they're talking. But they know that I'm hearing them and that I'm listening. I think language is a really, really important thing. And the art of case management is the art of wordsmithing. So sometimes I will, after an interaction or after I leave work or even while I'm doing dishes, I'll be thinking about, is there a way I could have said that differently or more effectively? I don't think with case management that we ever reach a point where the way that we say things is perfect all the time. But I definitely think that there are ways that we can say things. There are always ways to say things, and there are always ways to not say things. So the goal is to address the issue at hand, and to not use language that could be perceived as shaming, and to always avoid negative words. So don't, can't, shouldn't, wrong, bad, unacceptable, inappropriate. They're not my favorite words to use, not my favorite phrases. I prefer words like, preferable, chosen, sufficient, possible, optimal, awesome. Because even when you're saying, even when you're saying something that is, even when you're saying something that is difficult to say or that the patient may have a difficult time hearing, I think you can say it in a positive way. So, this idea of word substitution, I'm always practicing it. I think also words can sometimes sound similar but have a different impact when used. So it's the difference between saying your behavior is the problem versus this is a problematic situation. And then waiting to see how the person receives what you're saying, because if you're good at reading like visual cues, they'll tell you what you need to know by their facial expression or their body language, and that makes everything okay. And also, if I have something difficult to say to a client, I will announce that ahead of time. To them, I will say, look, I want to talk about a difficult topic with you, and tell them what the purpose is. The purpose of this is so that you don't have to walk around feeling stressed. But we need to address this. I'm going to take 5 minutes. Is that okay? And if they say okay, then everything is okay. I guess, so stepping back to words sounding similar or phrases sounding similar, I think there's a difference between you're doing it all wrong versus I want to figure out a solution to this problem with you. It's just, you want to use this inclusive language. And I think everyone's going to have their own way of putting these ideas forth. I don't think that there is a template for this. I think people just sort of it's trial and error. The one thing I would encourage is that people avoid using canned language. Otherwise, you run the risk of sounding stiff and unnatural. I think anyone that starts out a sentence with what I hear you saying is, what it will say, clients have heard this from other people that have been to motivational interviewing seminars who are repeating a phrase that is canned that they have heard, and that's not what they want. They want your flavor, your style. That's how they know that it's real, and that's how they know that they can sort of put faith in it. I think it's important also to research possible solutions ahead of time, and when possible, offer the patient choices. Because if people have, sort of 2 or 3 choices that are presented to them, maybe they might feel comfortable picking a choice as opposed to being put on the spot and having to come up with a choice of their own.
I think there's really something to be said in all of this about really sort of promoting an atmosphere of teamwork between you and the clients. Some of what James was saying about language, it's easy to tell a client what their responsibilities are, but that sort of sets up this dynamic where it sort of feels like you against them, and that's not actually helpful for achieving the goals that you or the client are after. Anything you can do to sort of align yourself alongside the client and make it clear that not only are you helping them achieve a particular goal, importantly, you're helping them achieve their goal. And there's something about putting the power in their hands through this process that is pretty important, I think.
What I hear you saying is that, sorry, yes, you're right, once again. And I think if you know your client well and you can sort of come up with some options or offer different perspectives, I think it will help the client sort of broaden their view of the world. I think a lot of our clients live in their own heads and may make assumptions about other people's behaviors or not be aware of why someone may not be concerned about why their landlord wants their rent on time as opposed to a week late. I think it's good to sort of present things from both perspectives. So if you say to a client, like, your landlord loves getting the rent and you're paying the rent, so we love that. And my concern is that the landlord might be upset by getting the rent a week late, even if that isn't your intent. I offer to check in with the landlord about whether this is even a problem for him or her. And then you can offer to work together to come up with a solution. And the landlord may say, you know what, I'm happy to get the rent, it's a week late, that's fine. Or they may say a little closer to the first would actually be optimal. Because, I think if you point out to a client that, your landlord may also have bills and may also be waiting for his or her money, I think that might put it into a different perspective so they can say, oh, okay, well, now I understand why you're sort of going on about this. And at the root of the problem with paying the rent in a time, there may be problems that the client has not expressed to you. So, it could be that the client doesn't receive their check until a few days into the month, and that's why the rent is late. Or it may be that once they get their check, they have to, cash it and get a money order, and that may take a few days. Like, these are very real situations where we could step in and say, well, I can let the landlord know we can adjust your payment schedule, and that way you're not late, you're on time, it's just a little bit into the month. Or, we can help you cash your check, we can help you get a money order, I could deliver it to the landlord, or I could give you an envelope with a stamp on it so that you don't have to hunt around. It's just the drudgery of getting an envelope and a stamp. That should not be the barrier to someone retaining housing. And also, there's always things like payee services. And again, I think in every webinar I've done, it's come back to payees at some point. And we believe strongly in payees, not because we don't believe people are capable of handling their own money, but because why should people be forced to go through the drudgery of finding the payee service is great because you can pay someone a little bit of cash, or if they'll do it for free, they'll take on that responsibility. The client doesn't have to worry about it. It's less stress for them. It's win-win for everyone. So, I do think that in the few cases where people have strongly objected to payee services, the sole reasons have been either it costs extra money, I don't want to have to pay someone to do this, and in some cases I want control over my money, and it's just sort of more of a control issue. And those are fine. But in some cases there are family members or other places like churches or other nonprofits who will offer payee services for free, and that way the person can avoid the fee and they can avoid the stress of having to sort of coordinate all of this themselves. I think that if someone has a lot going on health-wise or in their own personal lives, I think offering them a little bit of stress reduction in the form of a payee makes perfect sense. But again, it's up to them and it's their choice. And also, sometimes it's a budgeting issue. And I think budgeting is a life skill that everyone has had problems with at one time or another, myself included. Budgeting is tough. Budgeting is tougher if you're getting a really small amount from the government or from the state. So I think working with patients or clients before they ever move into housing on budgeting, actually on how their budgeting will change once they're housed, I think that can be a really rich exercise in helping people look at all areas of their lives and sort of different costs and finances attached to those different areas. And also, again, it helps you get to know the person. But I think there might be a link here at some point for a budget tracking sheet. I think those are really, really useful. But the bottom line is if someone is on SSI or SSDI, the real problem is they just don't have enough money, even if they're in affordable housing. Because things like food and utilities and other miscellaneous costs can really chip away at, it's rare that someone has savings at the end of the month. And in some cases, sorry, I'm just going on and on with this, but in some cases, people may have unexpected debts or problems prioritizing expenses. Are there resources in their community that can help out? So before someone's housed or if they're about to be housed, I think setting goals and going about like researching resources in the community can be really beneficial. It's a great way to empower the client. So are there rental assistance programs in your area? Are there places that can help with first and last or first and security? Are there drug assistance programs that can help pay out-of-pocket expenses for medical supplies or medications? Are there furniture banks? Have you checked on the free section of Craigslist? Are churches willing to donate items? Anything that can help your client pay less out of pocket and move in and feel comfortable in their home, it's going to be win-win. And And I think it's important sometimes to recognize that sometimes a client does not want to stay housed. And maybe his or her behavior is a symptom of their true feelings. I don't think that housing is for everyone. I think we want to create a space where people can express that without feeling judged or feeling like failures. I think for people that have never been housed, they're being told that housing is what they should want in their lives. So it is what they want. They try it out. Maybe they don't like it. It's fine. And I think sometimes clients want to stay housed but aren't able to for whatever reason. I think it's important to acknowledge their efforts and accomplishments. It's like anything else that's harm reduction based. Reassure them that you'll work with them on getting rehoused in the future. Let them know that you're on their side and willing to advocate for them, and acknowledge that they stayed housed for X number of months and that is a huge accomplishment. It means that if they want to get housed in the future, they'll be able to do it because they have done it. And pointing out that success is very, very important. So we'll move on to our next case study.
There was a question.
Oh, there's a question. No.
So from Maurice, will you guys speak to what the preventive work before housed with individuals who have no income? So I think you kind of discussed that a little bit.
Yeah.
But specifically for clients with no income.
So we do work with a handful of patients with no income, and it is always very, very challenging because if they're moving into affordable housing, their rent is taken care of, but then there's all that other stuff around it, the day-to-day stuff. I mean, that's really where we call on food banks and meals programs and utilities assistance. I mean, I think the important part is you never want to set someone up for a housing situation where they don't really stand a chance. So if someone has no income, you want to find out, is it sustainable for them? And you want to find out why they have no income. So if someone has no income because they're working on immigration issues, and it looks likely that those immigration issues will eventually be resolved, then they will eventually have income. And also it depends on what their support systems are. Do they have family that support them financially? I think we're a little bit lucky in that, at the health center that I work at, if someone has no income, we can help them apply for disability transportation, but then we can also sort of supplement their transportation from funds that we have. But I think it differs from location to location. Matt?
I have absolutely nothing to add to that. That was wide statements.
Yeah.
It's always a struggle, though. I've worked with a few folks who don't have any income, and if you don't kind of figure out what's realistic ahead of time, it means that every month it's a struggle, and I've seen things not go well for folks because we didn't do a good job of helping figure out whether the situation was going to be sustainable for them. And yeah, there aren't always easy answers.
But there is a way to budget for people that have no income where, you acknowledge they have no income. So monthly, what resources are we going to draw on to sort of help pay these miscellaneous costs that you have? I mean, again, you sometimes have to be creative, and sometimes, certain, aid service organizations or other nonprofits in your area may have funds for people in this exact scenario. I wish there was an easy answer to this, but if it's as simple as someone is applying for disability, it hasn't been approved, but it's expected in the next 3 months, hopefully they'll get some sort of retroactive check that will help take the edge off. But all this, for people that are disabled or have multiple health issues, applying for funds is always a process, and getting approved is a process. So it's just sort of helping to carry people through that lean period until they do have income. I think that's the key.
We have a new question.
We have a new question.
Do you want to read that aloud, James?
Yes. When does it become appropriate to house a person who hasn't been housed in a while? What markers, characteristics should be observed to help the client realize that movement is recommended? Thank you, Amelia. So I think...
I'll start, sure. My thoughts on this, and I have no idea if James is going to agree, that I think if a patient or a client is wanting to be housed and there are resources available, that's probably a really good time.
I agree.
But I think there needs to be discussion around that. And if it's someone who's been previously housed, and I think there has to be a discussion around what happened last time, what changes can we make so that, like if it sounds like they want to be housed and want to stay housed, having a sort of not just a one-time conversation, but maybe an ongoing conversation about what can be different this time, and trying to help the client identify for themselves and vocalize on their own some of the struggles that they faced. And maybe there's some things that you may know that didn't go so well, that the client hasn't been able to vocalize. And I think there's a bit of perspective that case managers can lend in that situation.
Yeah. I think we talked a while ago about wordsmithing and sort of, taking these, we talked a while ago about taking a very circuitous route to approach a very sensitive subject. I think in this case, you know your clients better than anyone. And I think in this case, I would take the opposite approach and be as direct as possible. You want housing. Why do you want housing? And what's going to be different from last time? And if said properly, that's not a judgmental thing. That is sort of, it's cut and dried. Why do you want housing? And let them explain to you why they want housing and what will be different. And if they're having a hard time coming up with that answer, it means either they're having a hard time expressing it or they don't really know. And you want to help them know, and you want to help them understand why they want housing. Again, oh, sorry.
There's an interesting, would you scroll up, James? I wanted to see that whole response there. I think, was it Christina? Someone responded to Amelia
We're
there.
scrolling. Christina.
I think that's an interesting comment there.
So Christina says, Amelia, I would look at how motivated the client appears to be. Have they made strides to get housed, or has every attempt fallen flat despite the client stating, I want housing? Yeah, exactly. So, we never, we are allowed to have our suspicions about whether housing will actually sort of happen for someone. And sometimes we're right and sometimes we're wrong. But I think it comes back to an earlier point about what is successful housing. I don't think we have clients that have been housed for a long time, but is it really realistic to expect someone to stay housed for 5, 10, 15, 20, 50 years? I think for some people the answer will be yes, and for some people the answer will be no. I think 6 months or a year or 2 or 3 years is a definite success. Amelia says, I agree. We find that when clients seek out change, become more aware of their behaviors, we find that change is occurring, and then we just change.
We jump.
And then,
jump at the chance.
We then jump at the chance to incorporate life skills, building behavioral awareness. Yes, exactly. No, thank you. You're right, Amelia. So sort of taking cues from them. But it does involve a little bit of digging, and sometimes that can be knowing how to ask those questions is sort of the art of case management.
One thing I wanted to jump in there with is when you're trying to assess a client's motivation and the effort they're putting in toward housing, I think it's pretty important to sort of take into account the level of ability that the client has, because I have some very high-functioning clients where I want them to demonstrate a lot to me to be able to, and because they're capable of making some very large strides, and I want to encourage that. But I also work with a good number of patients who are really impaired, and simply having them say the words "I want housing" is more than I would expect at all. Just kind of because of their level of impairment. So there's something about figuring all of this out in relation to what the clients, to what's I think realistic maybe.
I agree, and sometimes I think patients or clients will say, I want housing, but what they really mean is I don't want to be in the shelter. And I think those are two very, very different concepts. So I think talking to them about sort of, why you want housing, they may actually be talking about some sort of harassment or in the shelter, or maybe just hating being in that environment. Housing can really mean so many different things. It can mean congregate living, it can mean SRO, It can mean a Section 8 voucher. So, sort of honing in on what they're looking for is always good. And are there any more comments? Amelia's typing. Is she typing? We can whiz through the second case study.
Or
Or we can stop.
sorry, I don't see them.
Thank you. All right. So this case study, and this is based on me going to visit a patient last week, and their apartment was messy, and the housing authority had told them to clean it up, and they were having problems doing that. So messy apartments. So this would be a case of someone, I pay my rent. It's just my apartment is not in great shape. Again, this would fall under like lease stuff. Landlords do have an expectation that whoever's living in their housing will keep it a certain way. It's hard to know how to talk to someone about messiness because that is a question of degree. My messy is not Matt's messy. I'm pretty actually messy. But when I went to see this patient last week, it was messy. Trust me. So the way that I usually pitch it to people is, cleaning is a form of stress reduction. And for some people, cleaning can really give them a sense of accomplishment. What you're doing is you're bringing order to chaos. And that can be very therapeutic. So again, we need to find a baseline here and find out what people, what your client knows about cleaning, and how to clean and what their idea of clean is. And once you know that, you can sort of discuss and educate. I think it's important, you can research together, or you can offer your guidance, or you can sometimes learn from patients about cleaning techniques. I think just sort of including both of you in it and making a group exercise is great. I think that, we as a health center, we provide gloves and masks all the time to protect people's health. I think it's a way of protecting people's health and also letting them know that that we're in this together, and that we're willing to sort of pitch in, or even going to the dollar store and helping them buy, cleaning products are dirt cheap, and even if people have something as simple as a bottle of vinegar on their shelves, they'll be able to clean. And the other thing that I promote is the idea of cleaning a little bit every day, as opposed to this like gigantic clean sweep that can feel very overwhelming. People can either clean a little bit of one area every day, or they can do a little bit in a couple different areas. I think this idea of, doing things by degree is very, very important to promote. And also sometimes in some areas there are places that will come in and help you clean or do your cleaning for you. In the case of the patient that I met with last week, her place was messy, but also she had a serious back injury and she was in no shape to sort of be stooping over with a mop or a broom. So we were able to connect her to a place that can come in and do cleaning, and they've been in and they are doing the cleaning. But I think that's a horrible, like someone having a back injury not being able to clean their apartment being messy, that's an awful way for someone to lose their housing. So we never want to have someone lose their housing that way. Amelia says, proof and evidence, meaning providing client with small goals, instilling these styles. Instilling these styles that allow myself and coworker to gauge what type of housing they're looking for. Oh, was that from the last discussion, or is this a new one? Okay, so what am I talking about? But you are actually hitting on something about sort of like small goals. It applies, small goals are always better whether it comes to cleaning or retaining housing. Just making things manageable for the client, and that will come through knowing the client and making it easy for them. And also things like lists of weekly or daily chores that need to get done with a schedule so that the patient can chart their own success. If you make a list of things that need to be done in the next day or the next week, you have a checkbox over them. You have, next to the chores, when those chores are done, you have a visual reminder of the person's success. There's nothing better than being able to say to a client, see, I knew you could do this. And also I think the secondary gain is after a client cleans their apartment by a degree, the place is looking great, not only do they have that life skill to add to their accomplishments, but they can look around at the end of the day and say, you know, my place looks great, and I did this. And the chores, as with anything else, you know, get them talking about what they love and what they hate. With the stuff they love, have them teach you what they love, have them teach you how to do that chore, have them show you how good they are at it. With chores that they hate, have them describe how they do that chore, have them describe what they hate about it, and then you can work on sort of like, maybe like, I have a humbling experience about learning how to clean the other day where someone showed me something. I had been doing it wrong all along. I was very frustrated by this. They showed me how to do it right, and it was an epiphany for me. I was like, great, now I know how to do this. So we all have these experiences, like no one holds all of the knowledge about cleaning or anything else. So anything you can learn from a patient or teach a patient, it's going to help everyone feel better in a number of ways. But I think the key is sort of this structure when it comes to, you know, sort of how are you going to approach the cleaning? You know, what's your plan? What's our plan for it? What's the list that we're going to use? What are the chores? You know, having that structure can improve the individual's self-esteem. Just always, you know, as Matt said again and again, acknowledge the accomplishments, large and small. So I think at the end of this webinar, we've included some tools, some online tools. We'll be making these slides available to people. So, you know, these budgeting sheets here. I've started using this. You know, I used it as a sample to see how it worked for me. You'll learn things about yourselves by using a budgeting sheet. You'll learn things about yourself by using a grocery shopping list or a food and mood diary or a cleaning checklist. The key here is that, you know, like the reason they tell you not to go grocery shopping when you're hungry is your food and your mood and your budget, it's all connected. It's all one big tangle. So anything you can do to sort of help acknowledge that all of these different areas of our lives are impacted by one another, and to sort of acknowledge that, you know, when it comes to budgeting or grocery shopping or food and moods, there are good days and there are bad days. That's just how it is. You have a day where you go over budget. It doesn't mean you failed. It means that you're sort of acknowledged, that in acknowledging it, you can sort of like acknowledge that, you know, sort of these ups and downs that life has, and you can sort of look at some of the reasons for why you may have gone over budget or why you might have bought foods that weren't on your list. You know, is there something else driving it? Is there some external factor? And the more that you do that with your client, the more the client will get to know themselves, and the more you'll get to know them, and it'll just sort of be a collaborative thing that will be good. Do you have any thoughts, Matt?
Well, my only thought is that, James, I would love to have you as a case manager, because as we were sitting here, I realized I have a bill due tomorrow that I haven't budgeted for, and I would love for you to be my rep payee.
Well, I'd love to, Matt, but I have 2 bills that are slightly overdue that I'm going to mail today, and they won't go out until Monday morning, so yes, they'll be late. Life happens. That's how it is, but thank you. So I think this concludes. Do people have comments or questions or suggestions or resources they'd like to share?
If you'd like to speak up, just hit *6, or you can type in the chat. All right. Well, it's a little past 1, so thanks for staying on, everyone, and we will reconvene virtually in June for our next webinar. Have a great day. Bye.
Thank you.